In this video, I'm going to be describing the process for which I made this anatomical art piece, which was my first real attempt at using epoxy resin. This actually gave me a lot of challenges, so the end result wasn't perfect, but I did learn a lot. In the beginning, I start by drawing the anatomical images on Procreate, and I did 3 versions: a muscle layer, an organ layer, and a skeletal layer. This is just a shot of me overlaying a couple layers and experimenting with the transparency and overall look and feel of each layer. After transferring the image through different programs, I laser cut 3 of these silhouettes in MDF. Next, I printed the anatomical images and also cut these out on my laser cutter. Here I am applying a thin layer of wood glue to the silhouettes and carefully placing the paper on top of each. Basically, if you leave it to dry like this, the edges of the paper will start to curl up, so you have to put a weight on top to ensure that it dries flat. Now, prepping the epoxy pour, I wanted to have the art suspended in the middle of the resin, so I needed to think of a way to keep it floating slightly above the bottom of the mold. So I'm using metal spacers and a thin crosspiece to see the height that it needs to be. Cutting a corresponding piece of scrap wood that same height. Now I can use double-sided tape to the crosscut piece and then remove the spacers, and it should be suspended at the exact height that I want. Now, doing the resin pour would have been so much easier if not for the fact I wanted this piece to be double-sided, with paper glued on both sides of the silhouette. So the approach I took was to pour the resin such that the cutout was only partially embedded in the resin after it cured. Then I laser cut out another image, and I use a slightly different color scheme here. Here I'm cleaning the charred residue off the edges. Applying a thin layer of glue on the exposed side, placing the image down, and once again applying some weight to make sure it dries flat. I thought this would be the second and final pour for the molds, but boy, I was wrong here. Before this project, I didn't really quite appreciate how difficult working with epoxy is. It just seemed like I kept discovering new problems every day, and it was super frustrating. Here you can see some bubbles that started coming out of the MDF because I didn't seal it properly. And here's another list of many issues that I ran into. At first glance, it looks okay, but there's actually some soft spots in the middle that I had to manually carve out and fix. So this is one of the last shots I'm going to show here, just working with the resin before I move on to the woodworking. The next couple of shots are me milling some walnut via joining and planing, which is the first step of virtually all woodworking projects. Next, I am making some rip cuts to be used as stock. These are going to be the frames on the outside of the resin blocks. So I'm cutting some grooves into the stock to match the width of the resin block. Here's a little tester piece. The resin blocks ended up being more thicker than I wanted it to be, but we'll just have to move on and work with it. I decided to do a rabbet joint for the frames, so I'm cutting away half the material from the end of the stock pieces. I think this method is a little more forgiving than doing miter joints, so that's what we're going to do here. Here I'm gluing up the frames, and you'll notice that I have blue tape over the blocks of resin, basically learning from my mistakes because it's super easy to scratch the surface by accident, and I was done dealing with the resin issues, so hence the blue tape. With the rabbet joint, I tend to cut the pieces larger than I need to, so I just need to trim off the overhangs with a flush cut saw. Now I'm cutting some blocks of wood, and I'll call these spacers for now. And I'll call these blocks of wood runners, and I'm going to be cutting some dados into the runners to accept the spacer blocks, which will make more sense in just a moment. Here I'm dry fitting the spacer blocks into the runners. And then gluing them all together. This cut isn't necessary, it's just a little 45-degree cut just to give a little additional accent to the design. Here I have two pieces of wood that will go underneath the runners, and I am cutting dados for the runners to slot into. Having the pieces taped together is a quick way to make the cuts at the same time and ensure that they're equally spaced. Here's another dry fit. Next, I wanted to elevate the platform and decided that these diagonal legs were more visually interesting, so that's what I went with. I thought about different ways to try to clamp these legs in place, but ultimately just decided to eyeball it and use tape as a method to kind of hold things in place. Other methods just seem to overcomplicate this. Now I'm gluing the diagonal legs with basically no clamps. So then I thought about it more and realized this is probably going to be pretty weak. Therefore I decided to make a cross cut along the joint and use a piece of cherry as a spline. Trimming away the excess. Some more sanding. Another dry fit. Here I'm trimming the edges of the legs so that I can attach them to the inside of a base I'm going to make. I cut this piece off camera. You can see how it attaches. Also off camera, I cut more pieces of wood such that the base will be connected via half lap joints. Here is the glue up of the base. I didn't actually glue the entire assembly together yet because I wanted to sand and finish the base separately. Unfortunately, I didn't quite measure the half laps correctly, so the base was not flush at the joints. I took the lazy way out, which I later regretted because I ended up sanding too much material off, but here I'm using a belt sander to make the base flat at the corners. I glued the legs to the base off camera, and now I'm gluing the runners into these dados and using the frames to make sure everything is aligned during the glue up. Now it's time to remove the tape for the artwork reveal. Applying some linseed oil to the walnut as the finish, I ended up getting some of the oil on the resin itself, which was another issue. was actually quite annoying. It took a surprisingly long amount of time and a lot of elbow grease to remove it from the resin. Maybe I'll say at this point that I wasn't 100% pleased with the final design of this project, but I did learn a lot and I experimented with some new techniques, so it was still an overall win for me. Don't get me wrong, there are some cool elements to this project, but honestly the end result just felt heavier and more chunkier and less refined than my original intention. But you know, that's all part of the process, so I guess I'll just be quiet now. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. And with that, have a great day and take it easy.